Torsten Lindquist knelt in waist-deep snow in front of his cabin, brushing white powder from the wooden slats of a structure that extended into the frozen earth like a buried chimney laid on its side. Orange firelight glowed through the gaps, radiating warmth up through the snow, while neighboring cabins sat cold and lifeless 3 days into the blizzard. Before we dive in, let us know where you're watching from, and if stories like this move you, hit that subscribe button. Torsten Lindquist found his brother frozen on the morning of January 23, 1862. Olaf sat slumped against the cabin wall near the fireplace, blanket pulled tight around his shoulders, skin pale blue in the weak dawn light filtering through the single window. The fire had died sometime in the night. The temperature inside the cabin hovered just above freezing. Outside it was 20 degrees below zero. Torsten had been checking trap lines 2 miles away, returning just after sunrise. He knew something was wrong the moment he approached the cabin. No smoke rose from the chimney. The door was still barred from inside, meaning Olaf had never left for his own trap route. Torsten called out twice before removing the snow, piled against the door and forcing his way through the frozen leather hinges. His brother had been dead for hours. The wood box sat empty beside the cold hearth. Olaf must have fed the last pieces into the fire before sleeping, trusting it would last until morning. It had not. The thin log walls of their cabin bled heat into the Montana night faster than any normal fire could sustain. When the flames died, the cold had crept in silently, and Olaf simply never woke up. Torsten sat on the floor beside his brother's body for nearly an hour, unable to move, unable to think beyond the simple, horrible fact that Olaf had frozen to death inside a cabin with 4 walls and a roof. Not caught in a blizzard, not lost in the wilderness, not attacked by a bear or caught in a trap accident. He had died in his sleep because the fire went out. This was not uncommon. Trappers died from cold every winter across the northern territories. Most accepted it as part of the risk, like drowning or getting mauled. You kept your fire going or you froze. Simple as that. But sitting there in the frozen cabin beside his brother's body, Torsten could not accept it. The fire had burned. The cabin had walls. Olaf had done everything right. And still the cold had killed him. He buried Olaf 2 days later on a hillside above the creek, where they had trapped together for 3 seasons. The ground was frozen 18 inches deep. It took Torsten 6 hours to chip out a grave using an axe and iron bar heated repeatedly in a fire. He marked the spot with river stones and stood there until sunset, watching shadows stretch across the snow. That night, Torsten returned to the empty cabin and rebuilt the fire. He sat feeding wood into the flames every 20 minutes, watching how quickly the heat disappeared into the winter darkness beyond the thin log walls. And he began to understand that everyone was solving the wrong problem. Torsten spent the next week living like a prisoner to his fireplace. He fed logs into the flames every 15 to 20 minutes from the moment he woke until he finally allowed himself to sleep. He timed how long different wood types burned. Pine lasted 12 minutes before the flames weakened. Hardwood cottonwood gave him 18 minutes if the pieces were thick enough. Oak, when he could find it, might stretch to 25 minutes, but oak was rare this far into the mountains. He watched the heat escape. Standing near the fire, he could feel warmth on his face and chest. 3 feet away, the temperature dropped noticeably. 6 feet away, near the cabin walls, the air felt barely warmer than outside. He placed his hand against the interior log surface and felt cold wood. The walls were not just failing to hold heat, they were actively pulling it out of the cabin and releasing it into the winter night. Other trappers accepted this as normal. Torsten had accepted it himself for 3 years. A mountain cabin was supposed to be cold. You built a fire and stayed near it. You wore heavy clothes indoors. You woke up multiple times each night to feed the flames. You burned enormous quantities of wood just to maintain temperatures barely above freezing. This was simply how winters worked in the territories. But Olaf's death had broken something in Torsten's acceptance of normal. His brother had frozen inside a structure specifically built to provide shelter from cold. The cabin had failed at its most fundamental purpose, and when Torsten looked carefully at the problem, he realized every trapper was focused on the same solution: bigger fires, more wood, constant tending. Nobody questioned whether the cabin itself could be different. He began studying other cabins during his trapline rounds. Most were identical to his own. Log walls chinked with mud or moss, a single door, maybe a small window covered with oiled paper or scraped hide, a basic fireplace or fire pit, a roof of bark or sod over pole rafters. They were shelter from wind and rain and snow, but they were not shelter from cold. Cold passed through the walls as if the logs were barely there. Torsten noticed how some cabins performed slightly better than others. A trapper named Soren Halverson had built his cabin in a natural depression, partially dug into a hillside. The earth-backed wall stayed noticeably warmer than the exposed walls. Another trapper had accidentally built his cabin over a large flat rock. The stone floor was cold, but it stayed cold consistently rather than growing colder through the night like dirt floors did. These were clues. Earth held temperature differently than air. Stone held temperature differently than wood. Heat did not simply disappear, it went somewhere. It moved from warm areas to cold areas, always seeking equilibrium. A fire created heat. The cabin walls transferred that heat outside. The ground beneath the cabin absorbed some heat, but mostly conducted cold upward from the frozen earth below. Torsten was not an educated man. He had left Norway at 16, worked on a fishing boat for 2 years, then came west when he heard about opportunities in the fur trade. He could read and write adequately in both Norwegian and English, but he had no formal schooling in science or mathematics. What he did have was the ability to observe carefully and think through problems methodically. The problem was not fire. Fire produced plenty of heat. The problem was not wood supply. The forests provided unlimited fuel. The problem was that cabins were designed to keep out weather, not to keep in heat. Every element of standard construction worked against heat retention, and Torsten began to believe that solving this problem required thinking about cabins in a completely different way. Torsten's solution came from a memory he had not thought about in years. He was 8 years old, standing in his grandfather's root cellar in northern Norway. It was December, snow already deep on the ground above, but inside the underground room the temperature felt almost warm compared to the biting air outside. His grandfather had taken him down there to retrieve potatoes for dinner. The cellar was dug 6 feet into the earth, timber-framed walls holding back the soil, a thick plank door at ground level. Vegetables stored there never froze even in the coldest winters. Torsten remembered asking his grandfather why the cellar stayed warm when their house was so cold. The old man had explained something about the earth holding summer heat, releasing it slowly through winter. The ground below the frost line never truly froze. Torsten had not understood the explanation as a child. He understood it now. The earth was a storage medium. Soil and stone absorbed heat when available and released it gradually. Below a certain depth, maybe 3 or 4 feet depending on climate, the ground maintained a relatively constant temperature year-round. In Norway, that temperature was cool but above freezing. In Montana, Torsten did not know the exact number, but the principle would be the same. Most trappers built cabins directly on the ground or on a minimal foundation of flat stones. The frozen earth beneath conducted cold upward into the living space. But what if the relationship could be reversed? What if heat could be stored in the ground beneath and around a cabin, creating a reservoir of warmth that would radiate inward instead of cold? The idea seemed backwards. Heat rose. Everyone knew this. Hot air went up, cold air sank down. Burying heat made no sense according to common understanding, but Torsten kept thinking about his grandfather's root cellar and about the way stone absorbed and held heat. He thought about how his fireplace stone stayed warm for hours after the fire died, while wooden Walls lost heat almost immediately. The fireplace itself wasted enormous amounts of heat. Smoke and hot air went straight up the chimney and disappeared into the sky. That heat could be captured if it moved through stone or earth before escaping. A tunnel, an underground channel that forced hot air and smoke to travel through a bed of river stones before finally venting to the surface. The stones would absorb heat from the smoke. The earth surrounding the tunnel would absorb heat from the stones, and that stored heat would radiate back toward the cabin continuously. Torsten drew sketches in the margins of an old ledger book he used for tracking trap locations. He had no formal training in engineering, but he understood basic principles. Heat moved from hot to cold. Stone held heat longer than air. Earth insulated. If he could build a system that captured waste heat from his fire, stored it in thermal mass underground, and positioned that mass close enough to his cabin to radiate warmth back inside, he might solve the problem that had killed his brother. The design took shape slowly over weeks of thought and revision, but the core concept remained simple: bury the heat where it could not escape. Spring came late in 1862. Snow finally melted in early April, turning the valleys into mud and swelling the creeks with runoff. Most trappers used the spring weeks to work beaver ponds while pelts were still prime, making final profits before the summer season when fur quality declined. Torsten spent those weeks digging. He started by sketching his plan in the mud outside his cabin. The tunnel would extend forward from the front wall, running 12 feet out into the clearing where he normally stacked firewood. It would be 4 feet deep at the cabin end, sloping slightly downward to ensure smoke and hot air flowed correctly. The tunnel would be 3 feet wide, large enough to hold substantial amounts of stone, but not so large that construction became impossible for one man working alone. The digging was brutal work. Montana soil was rocky and dense. Torsten used a pointed iron bar to break up the earth, then shoveled it out and hauled it away in a canvas sling. He worked from sunrise until his hands could no longer grip the tools, stopping only to eat cold meals of dried meat and hardtack. His trap line sat untended. His income for the year disappeared, with each day spent digging instead of working beaver ponds. Other trappers noticed. Soren Halverson stopped by in late April, watched Torsten digging for 10 minutes, then asked what he was building. Torsten explained the concept: a heat storage tunnel that would capture chimney waste and radiate warmth back toward the cabin. Soren listened, nodded politely, and said it sounded like an interesting idea. His tone suggested he thought Torsten had lost his mind. Gunnar Eklund was less polite. He arrived in early May while Torsten was lining the completed trench with river stones. Gunnar stood at the edge of the excavation and asked why Torsten was wasting prime trapping season digging holes. Torsten explained again. Gunnar shook his head. "Heat rises," he said. "Burying it underground makes no sense. You are throwing away an entire season's income to dig a useless ditch." He left, still shaking his head. Torsten kept digging. He hauled river stones from the creek bed, selecting rounded rocks between the size of his fist and his head. He placed them carefully in the trench, creating a bed of thermal mass that would absorb and store heat. Over the stones, he built a wooden framework using split logs. The framework created a tunnel with slatted openings along the top, allowing heat to radiate upward while protecting the stone bed from cave-ins. He connected the tunnel to his fireplace using a stone-lined channel that diverted smoke and hot air from the chimney base into the underground system. The tunnel sloped gently, allowing the hot air to flow through the buried stone mass before finally venting through gaps in the slatted wooden cover. He insulated the entire structure with packed earth and layers of bark, then covered it with soil. By mid-June, the tunnel was complete. Torsten had lost an entire spring trapping season. His financial situation was precarious, but he had built something no one else in the territory possessed: a system designed to store heat instead of waste it. The tunnel system Torsten built was simple in concept, but sophisticated in execution. The key was understanding how heat moved and where it went in a standard cabin. Traditional fireplaces sent roughly 70% of their heat straight up the chimney and into the open air. The remaining 30% radiated into the room, where it quickly transferred through the thin log walls and disappeared. Torsten's tunnel captured the 70% that normally wasted. At the base of his fireplace, where the stone hearth met the chimney opening, Torsten had built a secondary channel. This channel was 8 inches wide and 12 inches tall, lined with flat stones mortared together with clay. It diverted smoke and superheated air from the main chimney into the underground tunnel system. The diversion was not complete. Enough smoke still went up the main chimney to maintain proper draft and prevent the fire from smoking back into the cabin. But a significant portion now flowed horizontally into the buried stone bed. The tunnel itself was 12 feet long, 3 feet wide, and 4 feet deep at the connection point. It sloped downward slightly over its length, dropping another 6 inches by the far end. This slope encouraged hot air and smoke to flow through the system rather than stagnating. The tunnel was not sealed. It was designed to allow air movement while maximizing contact between hot gases and the thermal mass. The thermal mass was key. Torsten had filled the tunnel with approximately 2 tons of river stones. River stones were ideal because water had already tested them through countless freeze-thaw cycles. They would not crack or shatter when subjected to repeated heating and cooling. The stones ranged from fist size to nearly 20 pounds each, packed together to create maximum surface area for heat absorption. Above the stone bed, Torsten had constructed a wooden cover using split logs laid horizontally with gaps between them. The gaps served multiple purposes. They allowed residual smoke to escape so the system would not back up. They let some heat radiate directly upward. They provided access for maintenance and adjustment. The slatted cover was strong enough to support the weight of soil and snow that would eventually cover it. He had insulated the sides and bottom of the tunnel with a mixture of clay and bark fiber, reducing heat loss to the surrounding earth. This insulation was not perfect, but it directed most of the heat either into the stone mass or upward toward the cabin. The tunnel ended 12 feet from the cabin wall, venting the cooled smoke through the gaps in the wooden slats. By the time smoke reached the end of the tunnel, it had transferred most of its heat to the stones. The physics were straightforward. Hot smoke entered the tunnel at perhaps 400 degrees. As it moved through the stone bed, the rocks absorbed heat. The smoke cooled. By the time it vented at the far end, it was barely warmer than outside air. The stones, meanwhile, had absorbed hundreds of degrees of heat. That heat would radiate slowly for hours, even after the fire died. Fall arrived early in 1862. By late September, frost coated the ground each morning and ice formed along the creek edges. Trappers began preparing for winter, cutting firewood, checking cabin chinking, stockpiling supplies. Soren Halvorsen and Gunnar Eklund stopped at Torsten's cabin in early October to trade news and assess each other's preparations before the isolating snows began. They found Torsten outside, clearing debris from the slatted wooden cover of his tunnel system. The structure extended from his cabin's front wall like a low wooden boardwalk half buried in the earth. Gunnar walked the length of it, examining the construction with undisguised skepticism. He asked Torsten if the foolish project had been worth losing an entire season's income. Torsten invited them inside. The afternoon was cold, temperature barely above freezing. He had built a modest fire in the fireplace an hour earlier. The cabin was noticeably warm. Soren commented on this, saying Torsten must be burning his winter wood supply already to heat the place so thoroughly. Torsten shook his head. He walked them outside and placed his hand on the wooden slats covering the tunnel. The wood was warm to the touch. He explained again how the system worked. Smoke and heat from the fire flowed through the underground stone bed before venting. The stones absorbed the heat and radiated it slowly back toward the cabin and upward through the ground. The warmth they felt inside was not just from the fire itself, but from heat that would normally escape up the chimney. Soren knelt and felt the slats himself. They were genuinely warm, despite being buried under several inches of soil. Gunnar remained unconvinced. He argued that the warmth was temporary, that once winter truly arrived, the system would freeze like everything else. Torsten pointed out that he had used half the firewood they would normally burn to achieve the current temperature. Gunnar dismissed this as coincidence or mild weather. He told Torsten directly that he had wasted months of work and income on a system that defied basic common sense. Heat rises. Everyone knows this. Burying heat underground is fighting against nature. Soren was more diplomatic but equally doubtful. He acknowledged the tunnel seemed to work now in mild fall weather, but questioned whether it would matter during true cold. A Montana winter at 20 or 30 below zero would overwhelm any marginal improvements. Torsten would still need to burn constant fires. The tunnel might provide slight efficiency, but it would not change the fundamental reality of winter survival. Both men left unconvinced. As they walked away, Torsten heard Gunnar telling Soren that desperation after a brother's death could make a man irrational. The comment was not meant cruelly, simply as observation. Grief had driven Torsten to waste an entire season on elaborate construction that would prove pointless once real cold arrived. Torsten stood beside his tunnel as the sun set, hand resting on the warm wooden slats. He did not argue. Winter would prove whether his months of work had been genius or madness. He suspected he would not wait long for the answer. Winter began gently in 1862. November brought snow, but temperatures stayed moderate, rarely dropping below 10 degrees above zero. Torsten worked his trap lines and maintained his cabin, burning fires each evening, but not the constant roaring blazes that typically marked Montana winters. The tunnel system worked exactly as he had designed. Heat from his modest fires flowed into the underground stone bed, warming the earth beneath and around his cabin. The efficiency was remarkable. Where he would normally burn 4 or 5 large logs through an evening to maintain minimal warmth, he now burned 2 logs and achieved better temperatures. The stone bed beneath the ground radiated heat continuously. Even hours after his fire died to coals, the cabin stayed noticeably warm. He woke in the mornings without seeing his breath, something that had never happened in 3 previous winters. Other trappers noticed during their occasional visits, but attributed the warmth to various factors. Perhaps Torsten had chinked his walls better than most. Perhaps his cabin's location provided shelter from prevailing winds. Perhaps the mild winter made everyone's cabins more comfortable. The tunnel system seemed unnecessary given the moderate conditions. Even Torsten wondered if he had overbuilt for a problem that was not as severe as one terrible night had suggested. December brought colder weather. Temperatures dropped to 0, then 5 below, then 15 below. Snow accumulated to depths of 2 feet in the clearings, deeper in the drifts. This was normal Montana winter, the cold that trappers expected and prepared for. Torsten's tunnel proved its value clearly now. His cabin stayed warm enough that he could work indoors without heavy coats. He slept through entire nights without waking to feed the fire. He visited Soren Halverson's cabin in late December to trade coffee for tobacco. Soren's cabin was cold, despite a fire large enough that Torsten could feel the heat from 10 feet away. Soren wore a heavy wool coat indoors and kept a blanket wrapped around his shoulders. He commented that this was a proper winter, not like the unusually mild November. Torsten mentioned his cabin stayed comfortable with much smaller fires. Soren nodded absently, clearly attributing this to exaggeration or different standards of comfort. Gunnar Eklund stopped at Torsten's cabin during a January thaw, traveling between trap lines. He stayed for coffee and noticed the warmth immediately. He examined the fireplace, which held only a small fire, then went outside to look at the tunnel. Snow covered the slatted wooden structure completely, but when Gunnar brushed it away, he could feel warmth radiating from the gaps. He asked how much firewood Torsten was burning. Torsten estimated he had used half his normal winter supply despite being 2/3 through the season. Gunnar acknowledged this was impressive, but maintained the real test would come during extreme cold. Montana winters occasionally brought weather that killed people and animals alike. When that happened, Gunnar said, marginal improvements would not matter. Torsten would burn wood desperately like everyone else, and the tunnel would prove inadequate against true frontier cold. That test came 3 weeks later. The blizzard began on January 19, 1863, with a temperature drop so sudden that Torsten felt it through his cabin walls. By midday, the thermometer outside his door read 15 below zero. By sunset, it showed 30 below. The wind came after dark, howling out of the north with force that shook the cabin's log walls and drove snow horizontally across the landscape. Torsten had experienced bad storms before, but this was different. The wind did not gust and fade. It blew constantly at speeds that made standing outside impossible. Snow fell so thickly that he could not see his woodpile 20 feet from the door. The temperature continued dropping, 35 below, 40 below. The cold was absolute, a physical presence that penetrated everything. He built up his fire and waited. The tunnel system had worked well during normal winter cold, but this weather was testing limits he had not anticipated. The wind created pressure differences that affected how smoke flowed through the underground channel. He adjusted the damper on his main chimney, finding a balance that kept the fire drawing properly while still diverting heat into the tunnel. The system adapted. Heat continued flowing into the stone bed below. The first night was manageable. Torsten burned more wood than usual, but far less than a standard cabin would require in such conditions. The tunnel radiated stored heat steadily. The cabin stayed warm enough that water in his bucket did not freeze. He slept in intervals, waking every few hours to add logs, then falling back into exhausted sleep while wind screamed outside. The second day brought no relief. If anything, the storm intensified. The wind piled snow against the north wall of his cabin to heights above the window. Torsten could not check his trap lines or even reach his woodpile without risking death from exposure. He had stacked emergency wood inside near the fireplace days earlier, anticipating bad weather, but not this. He rationed the indoor supply carefully, burning only what was necessary to maintain the tunnel's heat flow. By the third day, the situation became critical across the entire region. Torsten did not know this yet, isolated in his cabin by whiteout conditions, but trappers throughout the territory were fighting for survival. Cabins that normally stayed marginally livable became death traps. Men burned furniture, floorboards, anything combustible, and still the cold penetrated. Some abandoned their cabins entirely, trying to reach neighbors or settlements, and died in the storm. Torsten's tunnel kept working. The massive stone bed beneath the ground held heat like a reservoir. Even when he let the fire die down to conserve wood, the stored thermal mass continued radiating warmth. The snow that had accumulated over the tunnel's wooden cover acted as additional insulation, trapping heat beneath it. He could see orange firelight glowing through gaps in the slats when he opened his door briefly, heat radiating up through 2 feet of snow. On the fourth morning, the wind finally stopped. The temperature remained brutally cold, but the sky cleared to hard blue and visibility returned. Torsten prepared to discover what the storm had done to his neighbors. Torsten ventured out on the morning of January 23rd, exactly 1 year after finding Olaf frozen. The landscape had transformed into something alien. Snow reached past his waist in the clearing, higher where drifts had formed. The temperature stood at 38 below zero in dead calm air. Every breath burned his lungs. He checked on Soren Halvorsen first, the nearest trapper at 2 miles distance. He found Soren alive but barely functional. The man's cabin was frigid despite a fire burning. Soren had burned everything he could spare: his table, one of 2 chairs, boards from his storage shelves. He sat wrapped in every blanket he owned, shivering uncontrollably. When Torsten entered, Soren looked at him with exhausted eyes and asked how he was still alive. Torsten helped Soren bank his fire properly and shared some of his dried meat. He told Soren his cabin was warm, that the tunnel system had worked through the entire storm. Soren was too cold and exhausted to respond with skepticism. He simply asked if he could come to Torsten's cabin until the weather moderated. They left within the hour, Soren carrying only essential supplies. At Torsten's cabin, Soren stood inside for 10 minutes without speaking, simply absorbing the warmth. The fire was modest, the wood consumption reasonable, but the interior felt like a different world compared to the frozen hell of his own shelter. He walked outside and examined the tunnel system, now mostly buried under snow. Where the slats were visible, heat radiated visibly in the frigid air. Soren placed his bare hand on the wood and pulled it back quickly. The surface was almost too hot to touch. Gunnar Eklund arrived that afternoon, having abandoned his own cabin 3 miles away. He had survived the blizzard by burning nearly everything combustible in his shelter, then wrapping himself in furs and sleeping pressed against his fireplace stones. He looked 20 years older than when Torsten had last seen him. His face was weathered from frostbite, his hands shaking from days of inadequate warmth. 2 other trappers arrived over the next day, having heard through some frontier communication system that Torsten's cabin remained livable. 5 men crowded into the small space, but the tunnel system provided enough heat for all of them. Torsten maintained his modest fire, the smoke and heat flowing into the underground stone bed, the thermal mass radiating warmth continuously. The men examined every aspect of the system. They understood now what Torsten had built and why it mattered. Ivar Johansen, a Norwegian trapper who had been working the territory for 6 years, asked detailed questions about the construction. How deep was the trench? How much stone? How was the tunnel connected to the fireplace? Torsten answered everything, drawing diagrams in the dirt floor with a stick. The trappers stayed 3 days while the extreme cold persisted. When they finally returned to their own cabins, each man carried knowledge of a heating system that had proven itself under conditions that killed other men. Word spread quickly through the scattered trapping community. By spring of 1863, 4 trappers in the Montana Territory were digging heat tunnels. Ivar Johansen built the first copy of Torsten's system, spending 6 weeks in May excavating and hauling river stones. Soren Halvorsen started his tunnel in June after selling his spring furs. Even Gunnar Eklund, who had mocked the concept most harshly, began construction in July. Each man adapted the design to his specific situation, but the core principles remained identical. Capture waste heat, store it. In thermal mass, radiate it back toward living space. The blizzard of '63 entered frontier legend. 2 trappers froze to death in their cabins during the storm. 3 others survived but lost fingers or toes to frostbite. Settlements reported livestock deaths in numbers not seen in decades. The storm became the benchmark against which all future weather was measured, and among the scattered trapping community, Torsten Lindquist's heat tunnel became the standard against which cabin heating was judged. The innovation spread organically. Trappers who survived the next winter using tunnel systems shared their success with others. Men moving into new territories built tunnels before they built anything else. By 1865, an estimated 24 heat tunnels existed across Montana and the Dakota territories. The trappers called them Lindquist tunnels, though Torsten never claimed credit or tried to profit from his design. The fur trade was already dying. Beaver populations had crashed from overhunting, and fashion had shifted away from felt hats toward silk. Trappers began leaving the mountains, seeking other opportunities or returning to civilization. But settlers moving west discovered the abandoned cabins with their mysterious underground heating systems. Some recognized the brilliance immediately. Others learned through winter experience. Torsten left the mountains in 1867. He had saved enough money from 5 additional years of trapping to purchase farmland in Minnesota. He married Astrid Cleveland, a Norwegian immigrant he met in St. Paul, In the spring of 1868, they built a house with a modest heat tunnel beneath the floor, more out of habit than necessity. They raised 3 children who never knew frontier life. Torsten rarely spoke about his time in the mountains. To his family, he was simply a farmer who had once trapped furs before settling down. He died in December of 1889 at age 54 from pneumonia. His obituary in the local newspaper mentioned his Norwegian heritage and his family, but said nothing about engineering or innovation. In the mountains, his legacy persisted in forms he never saw. Heat tunnels continued warming cabins through the 1870s and 80s. Miners adapted the principle for smelting operations. Homesteaders built variations using different materials but identical physics. The technique never became widespread enough to earn mention in formal architectural records, but it saved lives in ways that went unrecorded. Modern archaeologists occasionally discover the remains of these systems, linear trenches filled with river stones, positioned near cabin foundations, purpose unclear, until the pattern repeats across multiple sites. They represent forgotten frontier engineering, anonymous innovation born from tragedy and refined through necessity. Heat buried beneath the snow, still warming the earth a century after the fires went cold.